Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jill Hawthorne, class of '87, and also a member of the Alumni and Family Engagement Team. I'd like to ask our alumni volunteers, Maria Guerrero, class of 12, and Lily Peterson, class of 17.
It's actually Jan Bragado.
I'm sorry, Jan Bragado. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. That's next week.
That's next.
So, yeah.
Not that I'm nervous or anything.
It's okay, Jill.
I'd like to ask you to begin today's Pitzer at Home session.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Jan Bragado, a recent former student of Joe, class of 2020, and I'm honored to be here with Maria and all of you to introduce him today. Professor Joe Parker is the co-founder of the International Intercultural Studies Field Group, and he's also the co-founder of the Intercollegiate Department of Asian American Studies. He also taught at the Claremont Graduate University in Cultural Studies, Women's Studies, and Religion, and Joe earned his BA from Occidental College and his MA and PhD from Harvard University. Whew. And apart from curating numerous articles and giving dozens of professional presentations, he is also the author of 2 books, Democracy Beyond the Modern State, Equality in Practice, and Zen Buddhist Landscape Arts of Early Muromachi, Japan, and the co-editor of Interdisciplinarity and Social Justice, Revisioning Academic Accountability, and of a forthcoming book, Spivak Moving. Joe is very well recognized among his students for not only having taught us well on the methods and intersections within gender, sex, race, class, culture, and the environment, but also the application as to how we can begin and continue to apply decolonization and intercultural understanding into our daily praxis. Joe Parker has been instrumental in my college career, not only because of his teachings in the classroom and his support as my advisor, but also as an advocate and ally for students like myself. When I approached Joe frantically during my freshman year, I came at him and I was like, oh my God, Joe, I'm freaking out. I realized what first gen actually means, and I'm first gen and I don't know what's going on. I'm really overwhelmed. And so when I did that and I shared with him how it was affecting my experience at Pitzer, he gave me more homework. But it was homework that was to reflect and journal the ways in which I can take care of myself and to find joy within it. And so throughout the next years, I continued to take IIS classes with him, and then I became his advisee, and then I was so grateful to have him as my thesis reader last semester as well. So today's topic is absolutely crucial, not only today, but it's always been crucial. And truly, thanks to IIS, I learned and unlearned so many times in order to become a more effective and considerate ally, not only in my API community, but across other cultures, backgrounds, and identities. And truly, who best to learn from than Joe, who was among the professors and institutional support that has advocated for me since freshman year. So I graduated this spring as a member of the resilient class of 2020, with many thanks to Joe for helping me get by those really daunting 2 months leading to the due date of my thesis and the end of my senior year through phone calls and Zoom meetings, where he constantly reminded me, just as he did freshman year, to take care of my well-being and that I'm very capable. So I'm grateful not only to have had Joe as an advocate, but to also graduate with him as he begins his retirement at the end of this academic year. So I'm gonna go hand over the floor to Maria to further introduce Joe.
Awesome, thanks, Jan. Hi, everyone. My name is Maria Guerrero, and I graduated from Pitzer in 2012 with a major in IIS, International Intercultural Studies. I'm actually in Portugal right now, where I've been since January. At Pitzer, I had the pleasure of taking 3 classes with Joe, Resistance to Monoculture, The War on Terror, and my senior seminar. All of these classes have impacted me in different ways. For example, in Resistance to Monoculture, I particularly took away from the class the importance of valuing Indigenous knowledge forms, which is one important way of decolonizing and rethinking power. And in my senior seminar, I spent a lot of time researching and thinking about the subaltern, particularly as applicable to refugees. One of the many interests I developed at Pitzer was working with refugees and migrants. While at Pitzer, I taught ESL to day laborers at the corner of Grove and Era in Rancho Cucamonga. And in my junior year, I studied abroad in Nepal through Pitzer, where I spent a few weeks interviewing Bhutanese refugees. And then the following summer, I interned at a refugee resettlement organization. For the last year or so, I've been traveling to 14 different countries, all while teaching English online, along with other projects. In Greece, for example, I spent a month interning with an organization whose mission is to provide a safe space for refugees in Athens. All this to say, Joe's classes continue to challenge my way of thinking even today, almost 10 years later. In many ways, his classes provide a foundation for today's topic. For example, to me, being an ally requires resisting a colonial framework of power and knowledge and continually changing this framework to empower the voices of the oppressed. For me, and throughout this past year, I've been traveling, being in new and unfamiliar places and cultures means constantly living in an environment of unknowing, discomfort, misunderstanding, but most importantly, learning. And I think the same applies to being an ally to Black and Indigenous people of color. I don't claim to be any sort of expert in this area, but I do know it involves a great deal of being uncomfortable to challenge and resist, as Joe Parker's classes have taught us. So I want to thank and congratulate Joe for his many years with Pitzer and the incredible impact he's had on me and countless others. And I look forward to today's discussion.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Maria. And thanks everybody for joining us. It's really great to have such a big group here today. It's very exciting. There's a lot going on. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. What I'm going to do today is talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a chunk of time at the end to wrap up and have some question, answer some dialogue. So there'll be lots to talk about. I'm going to introduce different ways to be an ally. And what I wanted to do was talk about 3 different kinds of ally work. And for each one, I'm going to give what I would call like a beginner's kit, something you can do in literally 5 minutes, either today or this weekend, and then some more long-term thinking. And the first type of ally work I'm going to be talking about has to do with the Black Lives Matter movement, what I would call like an identity category-based movement, focusing on changing the nation state, changing policy, something a lot of people are talking about right now, and a very, very important movement. Second type of ally work will have to do with Indigenous communities, how to be an ally for Indigenous communities. That's an area where I've been doing a lot of work for the past decade, and I've been doing some writing, and I'll introduce some of that a little bit later. I would call that allyship work that is focusing on what I would call the other to the nation state, that which is not necessarily addressed or responded to by the nation state. So it's a different type of allyship work, different type of organizing. And then the third type will be in a category that Maria just mentioned, having to do with the subaltern. How can we be allies for subalterns? And subalterns, I'll define that term a little bit later, but they are what I would call folks that are in some sense pushed out of the modernity or capitalism, the nation state, citizenship, etc. So I'll talk about that towards the end of my comments today. Now, I'm going to go ahead and put my contact information up here on the screen. One of my sort of reluctance in talking about some of the issues we're going to talk about today have to do with the, let's see here. Okay. With the fact that I'm a member of dominant groups in almost every category in my life. And so I've had to spend a lot of time thinking about how can I be an agent for social change in a way that doesn't take up space, that gives leadership to members of subordinated groups or dominated groups, oppressed groups in society. And I started to do that by educating myself in the 80s. I was introduced to, and this is not something I got in either college or graduate school. I had to do this work on my own, but I got introduced to thinking about gender and race. And in the 90s, I started thinking about class. I started thinking about colonization, queerness, and some other areas where I then started teaching through the 90s and up until the present in those areas. I've also taught allyship in a couple of different classes. I've taught about whiteness as a problem, not as a solution, in some of the classes that Maria took, for example, and that Maria has mentioned. And I've been doing some writing in these areas. So just to get started, what is an ally? Let me just pull up a little gadget here. Let me see, I'm still learning how to do this. Can you see that? Does it say how to become an ally? Okay, great. Okay, so what's an ally? I'm going to give you a really short definition, and then I'm drawing on the two definitions that are up here on the screen. The simple definition that I work with is that it's when members of social groups that are dominant in society act for equality or justice by opposing injustice, generally speaking, by supporting non-dominant social groups. So it's not just a change in attitude, it's not just an educational adventure, it's also developing a long track record of actions that support those subordinated social groups. And one way to think about this is it's a kind of betrayal of the social roles that are given to us by society that enforce hierarchy, that enforce inequality. So, for example, one of the most famous books that I found useful early on is a book called Race Traitor, where white people became traitors to the race by supporting members of other racial groups. And that's by a woman named Mab Segrest. I'm going to mention a number of readings today, and some of them are going to show up on the screen, but some of them won't. And I'm happy, and that's what that email address was for that I just posted. I'm happy anytime to email with anybody. I'll send you stuff. Jill Hawthorne and the alumni office are going to post resources on their website after we're done. Probably it'll take them a few days to get all that stuff up on the screen, on their website, excuse me. Okay, so a couple other things about this term. One is, I think there's four different, just to put it very simply, four different areas where work needs to be done. The first is you have to listen. And something that, like in leadership training, we're not taught to listen. So sometimes we don't always have good skills at listening. And I'm someone, I'm a white guy, I'm used to talking and thinking I know what's going on and not listening to other folks in other racial groups. I fortunately was mentored early on in my years at Pitzer by Agnes Jackson, who was a teacher in the English department in African American Studies, by Lourdes Arguelles, who was hired the same year I was in Gender and Feminist Studies. She was a Cuban lesbian feminist, and I started team teaching with her and learned a lot from her, but that was part of my training in listening. And there's certain skills in good listening that you can learn. That's easy to kind of look that stuff up online. Right now, what we're seeing is the Black Lives Matter movement is speaking to those of us that are not Black. It's also speaking to some folks who are Black who may not, necessarily agree with the movement. And they're speaking real loud and clear. And part of what the project is in being an ally is you have to listen carefully. In other words, don't just assume that you know what they're saying without getting defensive. Because sometimes folks in dominant groups can be a little defensive. And that's something that you have to kind of work with. And we're going to talk some more about that later in the presentation today. Learning is the second key skill. And that's primarily self-education. Members of subordinated groups don't always have time or the interest in educating folks that are ignorant or don't know history, don't know what solutions have been practiced all around history. So you need to learn history and you need to learn solutions. Solutions are everywhere in the world for all kinds of problems that look intractable, for people in what look like impossible situations. People survive in impossible situations all the time. How do they do that? That's something I did in my Democracy Beyond the State book. And I'm going to reference a couple of sections, specific sections to that book later today. Take action. This is the thing that a lot of people stop with number one and number two, step number one, step number two, and they don't get to the action part because it's easier to just kind of like change how you think and not do anything about it. And one of the most important things, I think, in any time you address social injustice is you have to do something about it. Something that changes material relations, that changes the world in a physical way. And so you have to think about how to do that. When you act, this is a key thing, a lot of people forget this, you want to act as a member of a dominant group under the leadership of the non-dominant group members. That's not as simple as it sounds, and we're going to talk about some issues there. But when it comes to action, you want to fight for equality. You want to do things that promote equality and justice. And the fourth aspect is something, again, some people do one or two things and then they think they're done. And for me, it's very much about building trust. And you do that by showing up consistently, number one, and sticking around for the long haul, number two. So it's a long-term commitment. Now we're going to talk about finding your lane, learning what type of ally work works for you. That's in some sense the reason I set up with 3 different options, 3 different types of ally work, and also the beginner kit, you know, for each one of these 3 different types of ally work. Maybe one will work for you, maybe one won't work for you. And so you just need to find your lane. We're going to be talking more about finding your lane later. One of the last thing before I get into this, the first type of ally work is the term allies. Not everyone likes this term. Some people are actively opposed to allies because the term has been abused. Because people will come in, claim they're an ally, and then betray the organization or hurt the organization. Or they'll say they're going to show up, and then they don't show up when something's happening, some event is happening, and it hurts the organization. Or they'll come into an organization as not like an outside member, someone who's not necessarily part of the identity group, and they'll take up too much space. They'll claim all the achievements for themselves, and it really damages what goes on in organizing. And so for that reason, some people refuse to use the word ally. They'll talk about being complicit, or they'll talk about being an accomplice. You'll find online, if you look at into these debates, you'll find all kinds of information about that. There's also terms we're going to talk about later, some other terms besides the term ally, which obviously comes from English, to think about, and that, you know, some folks like to use. Okay, so the term, each of the different practices I'm going to talk about also has pitfalls and drawbacks, and we're going to talk about those as we go through each one. Okay, so let's get started here with the first type of ally work, and that is working in a kind of support role, let's say as a white person, as a Latino, as an Asian American, as an Indigenous person with the Black Lives Movement. We're hearing about this movement in the newspapers. It's had a lot of tremendous successes just in the past few weeks. And, you know, it's addressing a very, very important issue, and that has to do with violence, with state violence, police violence, and other kinds of armed violence. And so that's the kind of listening, just noticing that that's going on, and then checking out their website, finding out what they have to say. That's another kind of listening. And I'm going to scroll down here. And the first couple of resources, we're going to talk about more of these later in the presentation, but these websites right here are, you know, great websites to start with. blacklivesmatter.com, and the M4BL is the Movement for Black Lives, or that's a multiracial movement. That's the group that I've been participating in and trying to carry out some sort of support function in some way or another, because it's multiracial. And so I can be more actively involved in that organization as a white person. Okay, so that's the first step, is listening. Second step is learning. Now, in terms of learning, I would say there's 2 different types of learning that's very helpful for this kind of identity-based movement. And we're talking about Black Lives Matter as an example, but there's other kinds of identity-based movements. And I'm going to just very quickly go over some of that. For example, if you wanted to say, learn about race in the US, learn about police violence, the history of police violence, that's pretty easy to do. It's with the internet, you just like Google that topic and you'll get a ton of resources. Also, these websites, the Black Lives Matter website, the Movement for Black Lives Matter, Movement for Black Lives website, those have tremendously useful resources as well. They have their version of history. But when we learn, you have to learn about history. And for the US, it's primarily post-Civil War history. Slavery, in some ways, many ways, ended in 1865, but anti-Black violence did not end at that time. And obviously it has not ended yet. So if you're interested in some specific readings, to do some reading about post-Civil War, you know, race relations in the US, send me an email. I'll be happy to send you some resources. I also, you know, right now is the anniversary of the Tulsa sort of race massacre. I happen to have lived in Tulsa. My mother's from Tulsa. My grandmother's from Tulsa. And I lived there as a young person. And so just learning about major events like that is also part of this work. But I would encourage you not just to learn about race in the US, but to always broaden your scope. So think also about global race relations. And my favorite book is by a Native American scholar named Jack Forbes. And he wrote a book about race relations. And it's about the race categories, the whole history of race categories. It's an amazing book. And if you're interested in that title, I'll send me an email. I'll be happy to send you that title if you want to learn about race in a global scope. You'll see that race is tied directly to colonization. And that's also true, not just in North America. It's true all over the world. Okay. You also will have to learn about whiteness. And this can be a little uncomfortable if you're not used to thinking about whiteness as a problem. Maybe you're not used to thinking about whiteness at all. And this sort of step into, and I appreciated Maria's comments on this, the step into being comfortable with being a little uncomfortable is, I think, the most sort of difficult step that many people have trouble with. And if you have trouble with that step, email me. I'll be happy to chat with you about it. You can also communicate with your friends, your family, and other folks on this call. And you know, there's lots of folks that are interested in talking about these topics if you're willing and ready to do so. It's also important when doing this kind of work to do what I call self-care, to do healing work. So accept the fact that you might be uncomfortable and be gentle and compassionate with yourself as you do this kind of work. Work with folks that you trust when you do this kind of work. And if you need to talk to other folks about it, by all means do so. They might be other folks who are a member of the same social group as you, and I've been talking primarily about race, but that might also be, let's say, men learning about sexism, learning about domestic violence, learning about how to change the current situation with domestic violence, or other members of dominant groups trying to learn about issues that need to be addressed. There can be some very difficult feelings that come up. Those feelings have to be processed. Otherwise, they will stop you from becoming an agent for social change. And you don't want that to happen because that means it didn't work out. You weren't able to become an ally. Okay. Also, among different community members in the United States, and this is also true globally, there is anti-Black practices, feelings, attitudes in a lot of other communities. Latinos have a lot of anti-Black racism in their communities, a lot of anti-Indigenous feelings, even though many of them are descended from Indigenous peoples. Asian Americans, lots of Black racism. I've lived in Asia. I've worked in the Asian American Studies, program. I've seen that in action. So some African Americans have internalized racism. This is something Audre Lorde writes very eloquently about. So that's also part of the picture, part of the work that needs to be done in not just thinking about changing attitudes, but also changing practices. But I think the second step, the second aspect to learning is very, very important, and that is the need to learn about solutions. And this is why, like, educating yourself about the sort of requests for Black Lives Matter to defund the police. This is something they're interested in having people do, having people learn how to do it. And it's something that for some people, if they haven't thought about that, they don't know how to do that. They don't know what that means. It just sounds threatening or weird, and I think what's helpful is to just look into what's the work that's been done around how to say abolish the police. And I'm going to try and share a screen here. Let's see if I can get it shared. Here we go. There is a city that actually did abolish the police. It's Camden, New Jersey. San Diego also went through a process like this. So you can learn about this kind of solution, learn about what worked and what didn't work in that setting. Let's see here. Another one is, let's see if I can do this. Los Angeles County, there's an organization here in LA County called Justice LA. They've been working with LA County to develop a non-incarceration or very, very low incarceration policies. Let's see, I'm having trouble finding this. Well, I'll send that to you folks if you'd like. Here it is. Care first, jails last. This has already been approved by LA County Board of Supervisors. This is a solution that's been discussed at great length with the LA County Board of Supervisors, with the county sheriff, with this Justice LA group and a number of other groups. I think 35 groups were involved in these discussions, and it's been voted and approved by LA County. So you can just look into this sort of solution that's available. I think this helps folks who are doing ally work understand where the movements are going, and so you can follow more actively. So you're informed about what the solutions are for these movements. Okay, so what's the beginner's kit? Oh, I'm sorry, that's listen, learn, and we're going to talk about ACT in just a second. But I think in terms of the beginner's kit, what can you do 5 minutes today, tomorrow, to begin this work? I think the simplest recommendation I can come up with is just take a matter, even if you're already familiar with the Black Lives Matter movement or the movement for Black Lives, or maybe you're already an African American and you're aware of some of the issues, but you can just look at their websites. Just go back to their websites and spend 5 minutes on those websites, and they're very, very informative and very helpful for understanding what needs to be done. Now, at the end of this discussion today, I'm going to shift gears, and we're going to talk about, like, if you were to do something for the Black Lives Matter movement to support it as, let's say, a white person or another person of color, how would you do that? We're going to talk in some more depth about that a little bit later in the presentation. But for right now, let me see if I can share something else. The most important part of this process, in terms of like finding something to do very briefly and very quickly, is, and that's the sort of reason for the, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with my Zoom screen here. Oops, oh dear. Oh well, I'm gonna skip that. I'll just stick with the what's up on the screen right now. The most important thing is find your lane. Find the kind of work that you can do. That's something, that's a phrase that's come straight out of a training session I was in 2 days ago with the Movement for Black Lives. Find your lane. And that means find the kind of work that you can do now, that you can do to get started. And there's a long list of different roles. You would be astonished at how much it takes to put on one of these protests, all the different roles. I had a handout with like 35 different roles. I'll send that to you if you're interested, but I can't seem to find it on my laptop right now. So let's just move on here. But you want to find your lane. Find something that you can do that you feel comfortable doing, either specifically for this particular movement, let's say the Black Lives Matter movement, or maybe it's another movement. Maybe for the women's movement, some of their identity-based, maybe it's the queer movement, the trans movement's getting a lot of publicity right now. One of these movements, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's actually to support the Black community in a different way, maybe by supporting healthcare that's needed in communities that don't have it, or maybe it's for job training, whatever it is. Incarceration release programs, what do folks do when they come out from jail, etc. There's lots of things to do, and just find your lane, just find what works for you. Okay, pitfalls. 2 things I would say are pitfalls for this sort of identity-based ally work. The first is accountability. A student I'm working with right now, well, I'm retiring in, I don't know, 10 days or something, but this spring I worked with a student. She's going to be a senior next year. And, she was interested in a group called SURJ, Stand Up for Racial Justice, SURJ, pretty famous group. And she was looking around like, hey, this group any good? And you want to do your research. And she found that there's this post on Huffington Post detailing all the problems with SURJ, S-U-R-J. And one of the main problems is they're not accountable to the African-American community. They're not accountable to people of color in terms of their boards and their accountability mechanisms. They have the mechanisms, but they have not carried them out very effectively. And so this is a weakness for the identity-based work, is you want to make sure you work with an organization that is being held accountable somehow to the group they claim to be supporting. Whatever that means. It means different things in different movements. The other thing about identity-based movements is they limit you to a particular identity group. And we're going to talk in just a minute about other ways to do activism besides that kind of identity-based work. Okay. So let's talk about a different kind of allyship work. This is not identity-based work in the same way that the other work is. Let's talk about being an ally for Indigenous people. Now, this is an area where I have done some writing, and I'm going to introduce you, if I can find it, I'm going to introduce you to, see if I can find it here, a brochure that I worked on. I don't know what this is. Hold on a second. I'm still learning how to do Zoom. I taught a whole semester using Zoom, and I'm still learning. There we go. Okay, so this is a brochure that I worked on. It's going to be posted on the website. How to become an ally to Indigenous people. I co-authored this with 2 other white people, but we worked under the supervision of this group, the 7th Generation Fund for Indigenous Peoples, and they're a great group. They're in Northern California, and but they're international in scope. They work with Australia, New Zealand. They work in Central America and South America. They work in the U.S. and Canada. Now, they promote this practice that's associated with the Iroquois, and I'm just going to show you an example of this kind of practice. So they promote something called polishing the covenant chain. And what that means is holding communities to treaties. Now, most of you know, most treaties have been violated. They've been just ignored, and in a very negative way for Indigenous peoples. But the communities, the Indigenous communities that signed those understandings, they want them to be observed, and there's different ways to revive them. And so this is something that the Iroquois do. And if you know the Iroquois, they are one of the most important political groups for the founding of the United States. They are the reason why we have federalism in the United States. They did all sorts of very important work with the Dutch before the British, with the British, and with the US. General Washington went out to visit with them a number of times before the Revolutionary War started, because they're a very powerful group. And so this is a really important model for folks in the US to think about. It's a model developed by Indigenous peoples way before colonization happened. Some of these Indigenous models are 1,000 years old, or maybe even older. Another model that I like to use when I think about Indigenous models for ally work is something called The Common Pot. And here's a book by Lisa Brooks. It's called The Common Pot, and it's about a model called One Bowl, One Spoon. Everyone shares one bowl, everyone shares one spoon. Now maybe your hygiene expertise is saying, no, that's not good for COVID transmission or something, but it's a very well-established model, and it's for how to work together when you don't belong to the same group. And that book is about how that worked, what its history is, and how it was used in the northeastern US, southeastern Canada, and is still alive today. So that's the first thing. You want to listen to their models, listen to what they have to say. And Indigenous peoples do want to work with colonizers, even in a settler colonial state like the United States, like Australia, like New Zealand. There's all kinds of great resources around that sort of work. It's in this brochure. You want to learn history, and there's just a quick sort of list of major sort of things to learn about in the brochure. And you can see this list here. It's on, what page is that? Page 10. And you also want to learn about solutions, ways to strengthen Indigenous nations. And you want to learn about self-determination. What is that? How can Indigenous peoples practice that? Not just in settler colonies like US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Argentina, etc., but in many other places. And what is decolonization? That's a whole different webinar. That's a whole different topic. It's a very, very important topic, and one that hasn't begun, to be discussed yet. Now, the beginner's kit for this item is a map. And it's just like, learn who the Indigenous peoples are of where you live right now. Now, most of us who are in the US or Canada, Australia, New Zealand, we're living on someone else's land. And you need to know, like, who is that? Because that's who you want to work with in this Indigenous allyship work. For me, I live in Los Angeles, so I've been working with the Tongva, the people of the Los Angeles Basin. And some people are asking in the chat about the brochure. Here's the cover of the brochure. I was just kind of scrolling down in the brochure. So this is, maybe it's like a pamphlet. It's about a 25-page little booklet. Okay. And how do you, so that's the beginner's kit. Just look up, if you don't know the name of the people, look them up and learn about them, learn their name and get to know us. That's the first step to getting to know them. How can you act? Taking tribal leadership from Indigenous peoples is not as simple as it sounds. And it's explained in this little booklet that I'm sharing here. One of the things that you have to be careful of and be aware of is that not all Indigenous elders are old. Not all old Indigenous peoples are elders. You want to work with elders. You want to work with people that know the culture very well, but it's not always easy necessarily to find them. And some folks who maybe discovered that their DNA had one smithereen of Indigenous in it, suddenly claim to be Indigenous and they don't know their own culture. A lot of Indigenous peoples don't know their own culture. And so it's a complex topic, and I invite you to take a look at the booklet to understand how that works. Pitfalls for appropriation. Pitfalls for Indigenous allyship work is appropriation. That's one of the most dangerous things, is when non-Native people claim Native culture. And it can happen through jewelry, it can happen through dream weavers in your dream catchers in your car. It happens in all sorts of ways. You have to be very careful about that. And, it's something that you kind of learn as you go through the process. Also, the tendency is often to focus on culture and to not return land. That is the single most important, in my understanding, way to, strengthen Indigenous communities is to return land to them. And that's obviously a big topic. And so that takes some work and some thought, but there's lots of people doing this work. There's a really cool movie called Two Rivers about how this was done in a rural area of Washington. There's Trust for Public Land does this all the time. They have an $80 million budget per year to do this. So there's lots of folks that are doing this. And this is one of the ways to avoid that sort of pitfall in terms of Indigenous ally work. Okay. How can you be an ally for subaltern folks? This is the third type of ally work I wanted to introduce today. I'm running short on time, so I'm going to keep this really short. Who are subalterns? They are folks that have not been successfully assimilated or forced into the modern social system. They tend to not have a very good education. They often are illiterate. They often don't have land. They're not a homeowner. They don't have a farm if they live in a rural area. So they're landless. They might be landless in an urban area. And who is that? Those are folks that can't own their own house. They might be homeless. They might be unemployed and renting somehow. There's about 1 billion of these folks in the world. Most of us don't know this term. We haven't thought about this type of community. So this is a type of allyship work that takes a little more work. And I'm going to be very brief here. How can you learn about this community? You can learn about the failures of modern society, modern capitalism, modern democracy to reach everybody, even though they make universalist claims. That's fairly easy. That you can do that by just doing some online research. For solutions, you want to learn solutions with this group. How do you do that? I recommend an article that Maria reminded me she had read as an undergraduate. It's by Gayatri Spivak, and it's just titled In Response, but it's her take on what people can do to help and work with subaltern people. So Spivak went off to the mountains of Bengal in India, where she's from, and built some schools. And then she's changed the content of those schools depending on what the indigenous, the subalterns there want from education. Beginner's kit. Ask yourself where in your life, in your travels, have you met an illiterate person? How have you depended on landless people? And if you have, say, bought a mango or some strawberries or tomatoes that were grown by people that did not own their own land than you have probably depended on a subaltern person in your food, maybe in your sweatshop, garments that you happen to be wearing. So it's all around us. Take 5 minutes to write about this. Do some free writing about this. Act. How do you take leadership from the subaltern if you don't know where they are and what they think? This takes some work. I'm happy to work with folks if they're interested in this. Just send me an email. We'll talk about it. We can do a reading group if you guys want. But SPIVAC's key for action is develop mechanisms that give traction to what subalterns are always telling everybody. They're always saying, they always have, they have their goals for, what they want, and you just need to listen to them on their own terms. The most difficult pitfall for working with the subalterns is people tend to assume that they know what the subaltern wants. They want modernization, they want development, they want jobs, and that actually is incorrect. It's just wrong. It's flat wrong. And this is one of the difficulties about working with the subaltern. One of the first things you have to learn is you have to check yourself and not assume that you know what the whole world wants. And the other pitfall is people forget to build traction mechanisms, traction sites. And that's something I've been thinking about. How can I do that myself in my own work, in my own life? Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here. So I wanted to make sure we have some time for some discussion. I'm sure folks have got comments and questions. I'm going to wrap up with the following. I'm going to encourage you to develop an action plan. And that means like a beginner's kit item, and then something you can do like in the next week, in the next month, maybe tomorrow, I don't know when, sometime soon. And then a longer term action plan. And I was given, and I'll provide this to you guys. I went through a training on allyship for ally training packet put on by the Career Resource Center at Pitzer College. And it has this great action plan on the back of it. And I'll send you a copy of this if you'd like. It's really helpful. And it just helps you kind of organize what you want to do, because it can get disorienting, confusing. There's so many different moving parts to ally work, and it's not necessarily easy to do kind of on your own. Now, I promised that I wanted to talk a little bit about what you can do if you want to participate in some sort of movement event for the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I'm just going to do that for hopefully 1 minute here. Right, let's see here if I can find this. Okay, so let me screen share this. Where's my screen share go? Here it is. Okay, so let's say you decide you want to work with an identity-based movement, and you want to do something this weekend, because this weekend happens to be June 10th. Today is Juneteenth. It's the 19th, not the 10th, Juneteenth. And that's a big, important event for African Americans in the United States. And if you're not sure why, check out the websites, take a look. But they're having a lot of events today, tomorrow, and Sunday. So let's say you want to go, I don't know, just go to a march. And what you can do is use these resources, and anybody wants these resources, just send me an email. I'll send them to you right now. Well, maybe tonight. I'm actually leaving to go to one of these events as soon as we're done with this, this webinar. You can use this, let's say you haven't been to a lot of protests. So then you can go to if you guys see this down here, I'll highlight it. This is safety tips for protest newcomers. How to practice, avoid digital surveillance. Just some simple guides, take you like 10 minutes to read over. And then I spent, 20 minutes in a drugstore this morning getting ready, buying a couple of supplies and so on. Know your rights, that's important. This is all available online on these websites that we've seen already, blacklivesmatter.com and m4bl.org, or Movement for Black Lives, etc. So let's say you want to do something, but you don't want to go to our protests. It's the pandemic, and there's guides on how to stay safe during the pandemic, but you're just not interested. You want to do something else. You want to find another lane. Then there is 100,000 things to do. You can fund a bailout movement, you can find the approved ones. You can be a lawyer and help people get out of jail. You can, if they've been incarcerated during a protest, you can, I don't know, develop a program for people when they're let out of being incarcerated. There's lots and lots of things to do. You can make donations to these movements, etc. There's thousands of things to do. So just find your lane. And I'll end with that and open it up for questions and answers. I'm going to stop this. Let's see, I'm going to put the screen share back up. I'm going to do another one. And this is my contact information if anybody wants to be in touch. Oops, hold on a second. Okay, great. Questions, comments, please unmute yourself and go right ahead. Speak up. Anybody? Can you unmute yourselves? Is everybody able to do that? If you can't unmute yourself, just go into the chat and I can read it in the chat. Anybody have any feelings about this topic? Anybody want to share? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much
Oh, hi, Violet.
for taking the time to do this. Hey, good to see you. Good to see everyone. I'm going to give a sticky question,
Great.
challenging questions that I have no solution to, but that I do quite often. And one of the things I think working in the Native community with different elders is when the elders agree, things are going well and there's that leadership, but sometimes elders disagree
Yes.
who are from the same nation or same group. And can you talk a little bit about your experience navigating those disagreements in leadership and how allies can kind of navigate the minefields in that territory?
That's a great question, Violet. Thank you for that. I know you have a lot of experience in working with the Tongva and with other communities here in LA, so I appreciate that question. Sounds like you've run into that problem yourself. I certainly have. And I'll put it to you this way. We all make mistakes, whether it's working with Indigenous communities, whether it's working around a race issue or a gender issue. And one of the most important things I think in this work is just to get comfortable with making mistakes and with learning from mistakes rather than letting them kind of freeze you up or make you stop doing the work. And that means you're not going to be perfect all the time. And that's something that can not be easy for those of us, especially myself in the academy. I was trained to be a perfectionist, to get everything exactly right. And we have to learn how to not do that, how to be comfortable with making mistakes and then recovering from them. And if you're interested in this topic in terms of personal growth, you can take a look at resilience. There's a lot of really great scholarship on how to be resilient. But Violet, you're actually asking a very practical question. Like, if you're working with two elders and they happen to disagree, what do you do? And the general principle I operate on is try to stay away from tribal politics. And if you can do that tactfully, without betraying the elder or elders that you're working with, then do everything you can to just stay out of the disagreement. Now, if you happen to be already aligned with a particular elder, and that's something that has happened to me, it's happened to many of us who do this kind of work, then you may already be kind of caught up in tribal politics and differences of opinion. And that can be a hard place. That means that you're being seen as affiliated with a particular elder, a particular subgroup. In the Tongva, for example, there's like between 6 and 8 different subgroups. How do you do that kind of work and get along with everybody? You probably cannot get along with everybody. So you just have to choose, what seems best at the point at which this happens to you in terms of your work. But as I said, the most important principle is try and stay away from what I would call tribal politics. for disagreements that some of them have long histories that you are not going to be told about, and you still have to work in that sort of environment. Thank you, Violet, for that great question. We have a question here from Dana. Do you have advice for recent grads on starting conversations about racism and police violence in more traditional majority white office places? Fantastic question for like 3 different reasons. The first is, and congratulations first, Dana, on graduating. Second, the first sort of reason this question is super important is Dana, you want to start a conversation, and that's really important. This is much more than individual work. This is work that needs to be done in groups, and you want to build groups. And I would suggest 2 things. One is you build a group of people you can talk about these topics where you feel safe, where you feel like, oh, these people, they're kind of interested in race. Maybe they're committed to being anti-racist on some level. Just start a conversation with those folks. And then get a little bit more comfortable, maybe develop some skills about how to carry out that conversation. And then go into this more challenging circumstance that you're asking about, Dana, which is how to have and start a conversation about racism and police violence in traditional majority white office spaces. In that sort of setting, there's a couple of risks. One is you may be employed in that office setting and you might want to keep your job. So you have to be aware that sometimes supervisors, coworkers might get defensive around this topic. They might not have good personal skills at processing the feelings that come up when thinking about complicity as with white supremacy if they're a white person, or if they are an assimilated person of color working in a white dominant space. And you know, that means that there might be some consequences for you if you carry out this discussion without some planning. I think a good way to plan and some groundwork to lay before you start the conversation is identify 1 or 2 other folks, maybe they're white, maybe they're people of color, in the workplace who you already have some sense that they're kind of sort of willing or interested in talking about race in general. And start the conversation in a small way with those, say, 1 or 2 or 3 other people before you begin a larger conversation with maybe a supervisor, with maybe someone who's a coworker who you don't know. Maybe they seem a little bit more traditional in their thinking. The other thing about this whole Black Lives Matter discussion is there's been a lot of movement. Suddenly, poll numbers are showing like some people supported Black Lives Matter, like maybe 30%. Suddenly now, whoa, it's 50%. Oh no, it's 70%. Like there's a real shift. This is a very fluid time in public opinion. And that's something to be aware of. Like, how can you carry out some sort of conversation about this particular topic of racism linked as it is to police violence? I would also encourage you to learn a little history before you start the conversation with the office people. There's a really great article in today's New York Times, or maybe it's yesterday's New York Times. If you're interested, send me an email and I'll send you the link. But it was about how social movements are never popular when they happen. It talked about how unpopular Martin Luther King was during his lifetime and how that changes and why that is. So if you want to start this sort of conversation, you might ask yourself, like, am I okay with not being popular with everybody, you know, for a period of time as you go through this conversation? Okay, do we have any other questions? We got another few minutes. Oh, good, we got another couple of questions. Oh, this is a long question. Let me see here if I can read through this quickly here. And okay, having advice with opening conversations with one's church congregation. Great question for some reasons I'll talk about in just a second. Church congregation may be tied in with white exceptionalism, mostly due to ignorance and overt prejudice. As a personal, let me see here. Right. So the person asks, like, should I consider stepping away from this particular group for purposes of self-care, or for fear that there's no way to reach out to people in this community? That's a good thing to think about. You want to practice self-care as you go through this process. If you try something without preparing yourself, without developing a few, like, you know, co-workers, compadres, co-parishioners or whatever to do the work before you open it up and you get burned, it might make it hard to go back and do it later again when the next round of police violence occurs. So you might think about stepping away from a community, changing communities where you feel like they're more aligned with your own personal views, or finding a community that is comfortable with asking hard questions and dealing with hard topics. Let's see, there's more to this question. Let's see, how can I be a positive influence to open minds on the topic of race in our community? One of the things that I think people have seen in the Black Lives Matter movement is a lot of white people are showing up for these marches and these protests. You see them all the time. That's super important. Latinos are showing up. I was just in a meeting yesterday online with this Justice LA group, and there were, you know, obviously they were talking about actions for the Black Lives Matter events, but there were several Latinos, very articulate Latinos, most of whom had been incarcerated and then had been released. One of whom was a UCLA graduate student who were expressing solidarity with Black people. So that sort of inter-race solidarity, just by showing up as a white person or asking about these topics, it actually can have a very powerful effect just for that one reason. Or should you move to a different lane? This question, who is this? Can't read the name. Sandy, maybe? Sandra, I'm not sure. I can't read it on the Zoom site here. This is a great question for multiple reasons. One is, if you want to take like an easier approach, at least at first, you might pick a different lane. Do stuff on your own without necessarily telling everybody in your church about it. And then build towards, you know, bigger scope work you talk with your friends about, your family about at a later date when you've had more experience with it. And the other reason this is a fantastic question is churches are some of the most segregated sectors in US society. And that might be surprising, but if you know the history of churches, it might not be so surprising. And so that's something to look into, why it is that churches are so segregated. I know as a young person, I was raised Catholic, Irish Catholic, you know, all white church. And, you know, I've been in recovery from that for some time here. Okay, great. The question about what do you, if you face anger from BIPOC folks as you try to be an ally? I think you have to prepare yourself for that. I think there are going to be some people who are not going to be happy with what you have to say. And I would prepare for that in maybe 3 different ways. One is you want to have some mentors, some folks who you're learning about race relations from who are people of color. Or if I understand this BIPOC, I think the I is for Indigenous peoples. I'm not sure exactly what, I remember this phrase is a new phrase. I'm not sure exactly what it means. But you want to have mentors, people that are schooling you, that you're learning from. And they might be friends, they might be elders. I don't know how you're going to find that. But you'll find them as you start to do this work. They will come to you. And they might correct you. They might just say, they might scold you. They might say, nope, that was wrong. And you have to be ready for that because you're going to make mistakes. Second thing that's going to happen is sometimes people of color have been subjected to, I'll say, decades, maybe centuries of pressures to assimilate. And here we're talking about whiteness, but we could also talk about like women leaders being more like male leaders. There's enormous pressures on, say, Indigenous peoples to act like the colonizer, like sometimes life-threatening pressures. So they do assimilate. And they're not necessarily going to be comfortable if some member of a dominant group starts talking about anti-racism, or some man decides to start talking about anti-sexism, or interrupts domestic violence. And they may not be comfortable with that. And there may be a history, a very important history that you want to be informed about to understand why it is that sometimes folks may come at you and they may not be happy with you. But the third thing I would say is you always want to be working under leadership of people of color, Indigenous peoples, subalterns. You want to be working under their leadership. You want to make sure you're not getting out in front, ahead of or apart from the communities of color that you're working with. Okay, I don't know if we have time. We have time for one more question. Jill, we have time?
Let's go for it.
Okay, great. Another question. Let's see here. Oh, there's some more. Hold on one second. Okay. Common ways that community-led movements are infiltrated or weakened. Yeah, this is something that has been talked a lot about on the websites, Movement for Black Lives website and the Juneteenth website, 613.org or something, or the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a very important topic. There's lots to learn about this topic. They can be infiltrated, they can be weakened, they can be stalled. Sometimes their enemies are doing the stalling. Sometimes their supporters are doing the stalling. And there's all kinds of strategies for working with that. One of the, let me see here. One of the resources on that resource guide for being an ally that I listed is something by the Ruckus Society, and it's a resource specifically aimed at this question. How do you protect yourself from being infiltrated, weakened, and stalled? By outsiders or even by folks that look like they're members of your group? How do you work with that? And this is a similar, and this is questions also from Violet, but it's similar to her earlier question about conflict within groups. You've seen the Black Lives Matter movement has this beautiful whole arm of their movement now called Healing Justice. And it's how to work with conflict within the organization, within the specific chapters, because there's so much healing that's needed because there's been so much trauma. That trauma has gone on not just for the past couple of decades, but for the past several centuries. This is also true of Indigenous communities. There's tremendous trauma. And as a result, there's a lot of, difficult behaviors, and those have to be healed. And these organizations are actually about healing those wounds that need to be healed. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done in organizations. And you might just decide that's going to be one of your lanes. You're going to need to be able to build some skills around that. Okay. Thanks everybody for amazing, wonderful questions. Those were knockout questions. Oh man, those are great. Appreciate everybody coming to the event. Stay in touch. And if you want to come to the event next week, we're having another event next week on a completely different topic. And there's lots of other events the alumni office is doing. Jill, do you want to say anything else about other events?
No, I did just want to say thank you, and also to remind everyone we have an event with you next week at the same time.
That's right, we do. Next Friday.
Yeah, and thank you to Jan and Maria and everybody for being here today.
Thanks, Brooke, for your IT help. Thanks for everything. Thank you, Jill, for your work.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Joe.
You're welcome. Thanks, everybody. Stay in touch.
Thank you. See you next week.
Okay.